50 years ago, as Christmas approached, filmgoers realised they were in for more than just a seasonal surprise or two when they went to the picture house over the holidays. On December 26, 1973, film history was made when viewers were treated to a series of shocks that left a lasting impression. An avalanche of never-seen-before effects and a script centred on the biggest questions life can pose: the battle between good and evil, and the existence of the supernatural.
Fantastic movie.
It's really gross.
It was really terrific.
I want to see if it's going to make me throw up.
After half a century, The Exorcist is part of the cultural landscape, with rumours, remakes and references abounding. It is both revered as a classic and surrounded by myths and stories about its making and impact. Experts and critics are not even agreed as to whether it's actually a true horror film at all.
Tremendous film.
Just turned my mind.
I thought it was very powerful stuff. I thought it was very, very good indeed.
Oh, well, I rather enjoyed it.
I believe. I believe, yeah. Well, it was pretty disgusting.
Well, I wouldn't take my wife to go and see it anyway.
But I just found it really horrible. It just had to come out. I couldn't take any more.
Oh, it was about the horrifying film I've ever seen.
Really horrifying?
Yeah.
It'll give a lot of people a lot of ideas.
Now is the time to have another look and assess one of the most talked about films to spread its flickering light in the darkness. Boxing Day 1973, and the lines are not just around the block, but down the street and around the corner in every town and city where The Exorcist opens. And soon, the hype and publicity around the release of the movie becomes its own self-propelled phenomenon.
Somewhere between science and superstition, there is another world. The world of darkness. Nobody expected it.
Let's see what
Nobody believed it. And nothing could stop it.
There are no experts. You probably know as much about possession as most priests. Look, your daughter doesn't say she's a demon. She says she's the devil himself.
I'm telling you that thing upstairs isn't my daughter. Now, I want you to tell me that you know for a fact that there's nothing wrong with my daughter except in her mind. You tell me you know for a fact that an exorcism wouldn't do any good. You tell me that!
The one hope, the only hope, The Exorcist.
They'll come in and they won't be able to watch the whole movie because it's just too much for them, and they'll come out after about an hour, but they don't complain about standing in line.
I don't like it. I want to go home.
Makes my heart beat too fast.
I don't know, it doesn't bother me that much. But I guess it bothered her more than it bothered me.
This is the second time we've seen it. We still can't hack it.
No.
Why? I'm not going back in there. If she ain't out here, he will.
The sensation that the movie is causing creates its own publicity as it goes, and The Exorcist becomes that rarity, a cultural event that crosses into the newspapers from the art section to the front page. In an age without social media, it's all about word of mouth, and the word on the street is that you have to see this movie.
The Milwaukee Journal blared, "Fans line up to have stomachs turned." In Toronto, the Star gives a whole page to The Exorcist on one day with news photos of crowds lined up in freezing temperatures and a report that the picture is keeping the ambulances busy. Later, the New York Times devoted a section front page headline to speculation on the cause of The Exorcist.
Both in the US and in Europe, The Exorcist is the news. And for moviegoers, the experience of watching the film in a packed film theatre becomes as important at times as the scenes on the silver screen. The result is a box office bonanza for Warner Brothers and a massive hit. The highest grossing film of the year and any year before, beating Gone with the Wind at the box office and certainly topping any horror film charts. The Exorcist ranks in the top 10 films of the 1970s, alongside The Godfather, Jaws, and only Star Wars, which beat everything that decade, bests it. However, even a superficial viewing of the film confirms that The Exorcist is far more than a shock exploitation movie. Of course, given its vintage, it contains absolutely no CGI, and yet it caused a reaction amongst audiences that has never been equalled since. And then there's also the critical reaction. At the Academy Awards of 1974, the film received no fewer than 10 nominations, 7 Golden Globe nominations, of which it won 4, and countless 4- and 5-star reviews from even some of the industry's toughest critics.
I'm Harry Francis, manager of the National Theatre here in Westwood. I've been in this business 40 years now, and I have never gone through anything like this. It's exciting. The public love it. Anyone. Last week, in the rain, they stood as it was the sun today. Mr. Friedkin and Mr. Blatty felt sorry for the people. They hired caterers. They give out 3,000 cups of coffee each night, a total of 6,000. The public thought it was great.
I think it's a combination of factors, and I think it's a combination of the content of the film, which was genuinely, you think this is 1973, this is genuinely shocking. So the subject matter is we've got a 12-year-old girl who's possessed by a demon, who does some things which are genuinely shocking. Still, I believe to this day, genuinely shocking. The makeup effects are, for the time, really quite extreme. So the content of the film is shocking. There's the religious outrage aspect of it as well.
But you begin to see a number of reviews which say this film is amazing. It's so scary. It's so well done. You're going to be blown away. But don't go if you have a weak heart. Don't take the children. So that in itself is priming the pump.
Yeah, I think the film caught that kind of zeitgeist, that feeling like everybody wanted to know something about the unknown. And because it was made in such a serious, straightforward way, I mean, William Friedkin shot it almost like it's a documentary. It's not a stylized film. It's very gritty and real. And I think people just freaked out because they felt like they were watching something that really happened.
Well, when it came out, I don't think America had quite seen anything like that since the original Frankenstein and Dracula came out in 1931, and there are all these tales of people fainting in the aisles and people, having to run off to the lavatory because they were so strongly affected by what they saw. And it became a genuine cultural phenomenon. It became wrapped up in its own urban legends. You hear all these fabulous tales that people, went to mass for the first time in years after seeing it, that murderers confessed their crimes after being confronted with this. And those stories, honestly, I've never fact-checked any of them because it's like I don't really want to know if they're false, because I would much rather embrace the mystique that a film that has that much power.
Also, the marketing campaign around the film breeds the hysteria, and that's a model that's been copied quite a lot since. So when we hear reports of people fainting, people vomiting, nurses standing at the front of the auditorium. We've heard things like this before. So we had William Castle in the 50s and 60s, the director, who made sort of schlocky horror films and used to have would pull tricks in the auditorium. So we'd have fake nurses standing there, would have electric shocks under your seat for his film The Tingler, would do things like that. But it was all fake. His films weren't particularly shocking. Well, this was different. This was really, people were really responding to this film. So it comes out in December in the States, and people go wild. And there are reports of hysteria around the film. You've got Billy Graham saying that the devil is in the celluloid. You know, so the religious groups are taking on this film. They want to fight with it. So you've got publicity there already. You've got reports coming out of the cinemas of people fainting, being carried out. You've got reports of things happening on the set and around the cinema. So churches being struck by lightning near cinemas. So then the studio rubs its hands together.
It just really scared me to death. I'm just nervous.
Do you remember what particular scene it was that...
When she was in, what was it? When she was in a room, the doctors came in, and I guess it was when she was talking the devil's voice. Oh God, I can't believe it.
But it wasn't just the marketing that made The Exorcist so special. There's also an undoubted element of simple good luck in its journey as a production. Far from being dogged by the infamous curse, there were some amazing elements of good fortune at key times in its development. Certainly the release of the film could not have come at a more opportune time. Culture and society were changing. The shadow of the Vietnam War was looming over the country. The end of the 60s brought with it an end to flower power, and a lot of the feelings of peace and love had been replaced by a darkness, most evident at Allemont and the violence of the Rolling Stone Free Festival, as brutal death at the front of the stage replaced the good vibes evident at Woodstock.
As Mick sang Sympathy for the Devil, the decade of peace and love came to a grisly end, as a member of the audience was stabbed and then beaten to death by Hell's Angels.
And Mick really looked scared, the poor little lad. I felt sorry for him on the stage there in his silly little Satan outfit. I have to say, he was a little out of his element there.
Even worse was waking up to the news that the Manson family had caused carnage in Hollywood with the brutal slaying of Sharon Tate. The disciples of Manson helpfully carved crosses on their foreheads to show the world where their allegiances lay. There was no doubt that if possession was on the menu, then it was closer to home than most people might have realized. And Hollywood itself was changing. Gone were the days of Mary Poppins, The Sound of Music, and Camelot, and in their place, The Godfather, Mean Streets, Midnight Cowboy, and Easy Rider. There was a new Hollywood, and with a band of young Raging Bull directors with a new realism. The Exorcist story began in 1949, and in the beginning was the Word and one man, William Peter Blatty. When the Oscars were being doled out, he was up for Best Adapted Screenplay, adapted from his own book.
The winner is William Peter Blatty for The Exorcist.
I would like to thank Mr. William Bloom, who taught me the rudiments and the craft of screenwriting, and Billy Friedkin, and my late parents, who came to this country on a cattle boat, and whose love and whose courage have brought me to this moment and to this place. You've honored them tonight, and I thank you very, very much.
He grew up in New York in grinding poverty. Father left the family when he was quite young. They begged on street corners. He had a really rough childhood, but he was brilliant, and he won a scholarship to Georgetown University. They gave one scholarship a year at that time, and the exam was 7 hours long. So he won that, and then while he was at Georgetown, he kind of discovered his comedic genius. He began writing for all the plays and the skits, and it was very providential, I would say. When Bill was a student at Georgetown, one of his professors was telling the class about an ongoing actual exorcism. And Bill said that he remembered thinking, somebody should write about that someday because that might help people who were struggling with their faith.
It was in this house, on the outskirts of Washington, that a family battled with their 14-year-old son's condition. He was exhibiting many of the symptoms shown by Reagan in The Exorcist. Contortions, talking in tongues, shouting obscenities, displaying weird markings on his body, unnatural movements, and inexplicable events. The family tried every form of medical cure before turning to the church, and 2 priests eventually conducted a series of religious actions that culminated in the boy being cured. Now able to lead a normal life, with the exorcism attributed as being the cure. Blatty put the story away in his desk, but never forgot about it, and with his flair for comedy, began a writing career that would lead west.
And then when he finally went to California, one of the first things he did with a friend of his who was an FBI agent was to impersonate an Arabian prince, because Bill was 100% Lebanese. And he wore a black suit, white shirt and tie, and these black kind of weaselly-eyed sunglasses. And he would speak this pidgin English with an Arabic accent, throw in some Arabic words. And it was hilarious. So they pulled this spoof in Hollywood, and they fooled a lot of people. And the story was in Life magazine. And then he actually went on the Groucho Marx show.
Groucho, I'd like to have you talk to Arlene de Fraya, and her partner is a special guest, a visitor from the Middle East, Prince Kahir Allah. So, would you come in, please, and meet Groucho Marx.
Welcome to the show. Say the secret word, and you will divide an extra $100. Arlene de Fraya, huh? You belong to the Beverly Hills Friars?
No, I don't.
No. And Prince Alakazam.
No.
Is that right?
خير الأسود الخير.
Well, it says Prince Care Allah. Is that anything like it?
خير الله الأسود الخير.
That's close enough, huh? What's the idea of the dark glasses? Are the cops after you? Are you on the lamb? That's shish kebab, you know.
Lamb, yes, I like very much.
You're no more Arabian than I am. What do you think about that?
I'm a prince at heart, Groucho, and actually my mother is an Arab.
You didn't. It was pretty obvious to me that you weren't an Arabian prince, because I know. I used to have an Arabian horse, and I know what they look like. Well, who are you?
Well, actually, I'm Bill Blatty.
Are you a wolf in sheep's clothing?
In sheep's clothing.
No, that's a very snappy outfit.
Thank you. I'm Bill Blatty, and I was born in Brooklyn, just a few blocks from American Legion Post number 804.
And actually fooled Groucho until the end of the segment. And of course, he was brilliant. He answered every question correctly, and he didn't know the questions beforehand. Won $10,000, which was a lot of money in the day, and that's what enabled him to write The Exorcist.
But for almost 20 years, all thoughts about The Exorcist had left Bill Blatty's mind, while he concentrated on building a successful career as a comedy scriptwriter. Titles like John Goldfarb, Please Come Home, starring Shirley MacLaine, and Promise Her Anything with her brother, Warren Beatty, and the classic Shot in the Dark, produced by Blake Edwards, with Peter Sellers as Clouseau, as well as a number of other Edwards productions, such as Darling Lily, cemented Blatty's place in Hollywood. But all good things must come to an end.
In the 60s, comedy kind of died, and sort of a film noir was becoming popular, and he was out of work. So he thought, well, all right, gosh, maybe I can pull that story out and fictionalize it. At first, he thought it should be like a documentary. He thought, well, maybe I can fictionalize it. So that's what he did. And the the providential parts just get more and more fascinating. Bill was living in Aspen at the time. For some reason, he went to this New Year's Eve party because he had sent around the manuscript of The Exorcist and nobody wanted it. He could not sell it. So he's at this party and he meets one of the publishers. The fellow said, "What are you working on?" And so Bill told him, and he said, "Well, I'll publish that."
And that chance meeting at the end of 1968 was yet another stroke of luck for The Exorcist. It meant that the book was guaranteed a publisher. True to Max Jaff's word, the editor-in-chief who Blatty had met at the party, his company, Bantam Books, followed up with a $75,000 contract. And The Exorcist became a book that to date has sold 13 million copies in the USA alone and been translated into over a dozen languages. But to begin with, it hardly sold a copy.
And then when Bill was doing a book tour, nobody was buying the book. Nobody. So when he would go into the bookstores, the manager would say, "Oh, hello, Mr. Blatty, please don't sign any books because if you sign them, we can't return them to the publisher." So that was pretty crushing. So he went back to New York and he had pre-auditioned for the Dick Cavett show weeks before. And he happened to be at the Four Seasons with his agent, got a call, "Can you be at the studio in 15 minutes? Apparently Robert Shaw, who was starring in Jaws at the time, was supposed to be one of the guests, but he was drunk in the green room, so he couldn't go on. So Bill ran all the way, like 6 blocks to the studio. And Dick Cavett said, "Well, Mr. Blatty, I haven't read your book, and I don't believe in God, so tell me about your book." So Bill had 40 minutes to talk about The Exorcist. And the following week, it went to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And from there, it was history.
But even Peter Blatty was taken aback by exactly what that history would become, especially as in 1971 he faced the challenge as a first-time film producer of putting a major movie together, even if it was based on a best-selling book. If only he knew what was lying in store. Today, The Exorcist is fully embedded in our culture and honoured in all the right places. At the Museum of Moving Image in New York, one of the stars of the film is in pride of place as an exhibit. Meanwhile, where the movie was made in the nation's capital, it has established its own shrine to the film.
I think my favorite is the opening shot, which was actually done from the rooftop of a hotel in Roslyn, zooming in across the Key Bridge, a long zoom. I mean, it's probably 20 or 30 seconds. And it ends, you don't know where it's going as you're watching. You just see like a bunch of buildings and you see the river and you see the Key Bridge. And then when it finally stops, it's on the house and the steps. It's like, come a little bit closer, let me draw you into this. There's something going on in this house and there's something going on these steps. The ceremony to commemorate the steps kind of married two of my greatest loves. One is Washington, and I also love The Exorcist. If we somehow commemorated this location, this deserves to be commemorated. People are already going there. I was at work and I got a phone call, and up on my phone it said unknown caller. And so I picked it up and said, "Hello," from Billy Friedkin's office. "I have Billy on the line." And then he's like, "Tell me about this idea that you have." And I told him, I said, "I want to put a plaque up. I want you and this film and this location to be recognized." And he said, "I'll do it only if William Peter Blatty will do it." I contacted Bill Blatty. Bill Blatty said, I'll only do it if Billy Friedkin does it. And I said, well, this is fortuitous because Billy said yes. So at that point, it was all, it just started to unfold.
Thanks for being a part of the event. We're going to honor two great artists tonight, William Peter Blatty and William Friedkin. And we will officially commemorate the iconic Exorcist steps you see behind me.
Let me tell you what this means to me. It means more than any of the awards that I've ever won or that this film has won. Because, you know, there's a lot of people who have won Academy Awards. Mine is on a mantelpiece in my bedroom. It is only seen by my close family and friends. But this monument that they're about to unveil will be seen by thousands, I guess, tens of thousands of people, eventually perhaps more, that will come through here and that will associate the film that we made with this beautiful and historic community. And I'm really proud of that and grateful. And as I said to a reporter earlier, in time, the Rockies will crumble, Gibraltar may tumble. They're only made of clay, but these steps are here to stay.
This is a terrific moment in time for me to be standing in the shadow of a place that I still think of as home, my beloved alma mater, Georgetown, as I receive what I feel is the highest honor ever bestowed upon me.
It was a big deal, and there was a big buzz in the air. Everybody knew that this was something special. And so many people in line came up and said, you probably don't remember me, but I was playing tennis in the background of the scene when Kinderman and Karras are walking around the track at Georgetown. That was me. Or, you know, I was one of those Georgetown students that paid $5 to sit on the roof of the car barn to watch Chuck Waters fall down the steps. Everybody had a story like that. Everybody did.
It's a big surprise to me that the film, thank you, God bless you, that the film still resonates. I had no idea that it would.
3, 2, 1.
The event was a major homecoming for Blatty and Friedkin, but also, that event had a poignancy to it.
Blatty was very moved. Friedkin was incredibly moved. The things that he said as part of his remarks were just incredible. And it ended up being the last time that Billy Friedkin and Bill Blatty were together in person. And I didn't know that was going to be the case at the time, but in retrospect, it made it a lot more special.
And even Georgetown University, where the whole Exorcist journey began for Peter Blatty, has a memorial to the film.
I think the legacy of the movie is just that it's so tied to the university in the sense that Blatty got the idea as a student. He wrote the book using Georgetown University as the setting. He then wrote the screenplay. They filmed a lot of the movie actually on campus. There were so many members of the university community involved in the filming process. And then the fact that the students traditionally watch the movie at Halloween every year. It's just very, very, very tied in to the university. And quite close bonds seem to actually have been established. I know that a number of the film crew actually went into classes and talked about their jobs and the profession of filming. Some of the actors did the same thing, and that at the end of the filming process, the film crew and a number of university administrators and some of the Jesuits on campus actually played a basketball game to raise money for a university scholarship fund. The film crew advertised for extras in the student newspaper. It caught my eye that the advert actually went out on Friday the 13th, which I thought was very funny. And over 300 students were actually cast, more actually applied. And they were paid. I think for some of the students, it actually was kind of quite a boon to be paid.
But the greatest memorial is in our culture, in both the all-pervasive nature of The Exorcist and the way that hardly a few months goes past without another movie or TV show paying tribute.
What has survived the test of time is the hype, the phenomenon, the cultural presence around The Exorcist has never gone away. I'd be very surprised if you can find me someone who's never heard of The Exorcist, which shows how that film has transcended the horror genre, which is possibly one of the most amazing things about it. The size of the audience. It had an initial box office of 193 million off an 11 million budget. I think now it's at 441 million with the subsequent re-releases, which puts it in the top 10 horrors of all time. However, if you adjust it for inflation, it's duking it out with Jaws for the top horror film, grossing horror film of all time. I think it's a horror film that has completely transcended into popular culture. So we've seen it parodied all over the place. It's something that isn't just a horror film, it's a cultural phenomenon.
The Exorcist definitely, in my mind, is the seminal film, the film in the demonic possession subgenre.
I think it's a film that's become, it's beyond classification. William Friedkin, the film's director, and William Peter Blatty, the author of the book and the screenplay, have always been adamant that it is not a horror film. They never set out to make a horror movie. And that's hard for a lot of people to believe. But the way that Billy described it to me is that it's a film and a story about a crisis of faith revolving around Father Karras.
It's not a conventional horror film because it's very grounded and realistic in the way that it approaches the story. It is a horror film in the sense that it's totally designed to freak you out. The whole movie is designed to freak you out. It just doesn't use the usual things that horror movies use. It's, all the scary stuff in it is quite subtle and creepy, and it gets under your skin. And I mean, there's all the big, shocking stuff, but the best stuff in the film is the crisis of faith and the mother worrying about her daughter and the daughter just going nuts and you don't know what's wrong with her. And those are the things that get under your skin, not the head spinning and the projectile vomiting.
The Exorcist was really never considered, it isn't now, but never at the time, being a horror film. It was way too sophisticated and elegant, and the storyteller and the storytelling was much more sophisticated than an average horror film. And I don't think Billy liked the idea of it being known as a horror film.
And of course, you've got to remember that we have had a lot of sequels for this film, to varying degrees of success. So we have 97 Exorcist II: The Heretic, which in some circles is regarded as a very bad film.
The first film that came after The Exorcist, The Heretic, was, of course, unintentionally hilarious. And Billy Friedkin and Bill called it The Hairy Tick. It was just dreadful.
Reflecting on the Exorcist sequels, the thing that struck me about all of them is each of them seems to catch a different cinematic wave. They seem to be very emblematic of it because The Exorcist is definitely part and parcel of the new Hollywood. The film brats, this again is to me Friedkin's masterpiece. It's an example of just how good that era in Hollywood could be. And then we get to the sequel. It's utterly mad. It's barking mad. It's hysterically funny in places. But it was made by people who believed in their insane vision.
We have 1990 Exorcist III, which William Peter Blatty directs, and they go in a completely different direction around serial killers and all sorts of things there. But probably most famous for what is known as one of the greatest jump scares of all time, where we have the white sheeted figure appear out of a doorway with a huge pair of scissors chasing a nurse, keeps coming at the top of the greatest jump scare polls. And then the absolutely bizarre situation around the prequel to The Exorcist, where it comes out in 2004 and 2005 from two separate directors. There's been a stage play that happened in the US and in the UK that toured. There's been a TV show. As I've said, it's still in popular culture. People are still parodying it. People are still talking about it.
Looking back at the creation of the Exorcist movie over 50 years ago, the path to the finished film was almost as torturous as the struggle to get the book written. As well as being lucky in creating the book, Blatty had also been extremely clever. It may now be classed as fiction, but the people and locations in the book are all based on places he knew and lived in. Georgetown and its university meant a lot to Blatty, and also to the storyline. It was emblematic of how anyone, even an urbane metropolitan family in the nation's capital, could be affected. Blatty wanted a director who recognised the truth in the story, but Blatty was set on someone he'd met just briefly, and in a rather antagonistic setting. In September 1966, Blake Edwards had called Friedkin. Edwards had the funding to turn a long-running TV series into a movie, and Friedkin's name was in the frame. At the time, a young, aspiring director about Tinseltown in search of the right project to exercise his talents. But in the dark of the screening room, Friedkin had told Edwards in straightforward terms and strong, simple language that the script he had for Gun, which was based on a successful TV series, was basically a pile of dross and needed rewriting completely. As he made his way back to his car in the parking lot, Friedkin was stopped by one of the shadowy figures he had seen at the back of the meeting room. William Peter Blatty introduced himself and explained he was in fact responsible for the script that Friedkin had derided, and that he sort of agreed with him. He also added that he admired him for talking his way out of a certain job and for sticking to his principles.
After Bill Blatty finished The Exorcist, he always wanted Billy Friedkin to direct it. He had met Friedkin on a picture before for Blake Edwards that Billy decided not to direct because he hated the script. And Blatty, who'd written the script, was inclined to agree with him. So they became friends, and Blatty respected Friedkin for the longest time. When Blatty finished the book, he of course wanted Friedkin to direct it. And that was just perfect, except Warner Brothers didn't want Friedkin to direct it.
So to begin with, Blatty looked closer to home and spoke to Shirley MacLaine about the project.
William Peter Blatty was neighbors with Shirley MacLaine. She had also starred in his film, John Goldfarb, Please Come Home, about which the less said the better. And so he kind of modeled the character of Chris MacNeil after Shirley MacLaine, hoping that she would star. But things went on, and she decided to make another picture called The Possession of Joel Delaney. She was also involved with Lou Grade at some point to try to get a film made. That fell through completely, and so Blatty was adrift and needed to cast someone else. Paul Monash was essentially a television producer who had been doing Peyton plays. He was contacted by his agent, as these properties always fly around town, and he was interested in The Exorcist. He optioned The Exorcist and then did something which Blatty found out about later. As soon as Monash optioned The Exorcist, hoping to make it into a film, he sold it back to Warner Brothers at a profit. Blatty claims that somebody broke into Monash's office and found the relevant paperwork, and that's how Blatty was able to get Monash's hands off of the book.
Blatty heard that Monash, despite his recent success with Butch Cassidy, wanted to change the script and move the location from Washington. So, fortune had swung back towards Blatty. He had regained control thanks to that bit of Hollywood skullduggery, had a studio on board in the form of Warner's, and by now the book had been published, and thanks to the Dick Cavett show, was selling like hotcakes. The top directors began to circle the project. First off the mark was Mark Rydell, famous for On Golden Pond, who was working for Warner's on The Cowboys. The studio liked him because he was good at working with young actors, but Blatty really took against the idea and hated the work print of the Cowboys he viewed. Other candidates included Arthur Penn, who made both Little Big Man and Bonnie and Clyde. He turned the studio down, saying he didn't want to make another violent film. Stanley Kubrick also turned it down. He didn't want to leave the UK to work on it, and Mike Nichols, the director of The Graduate, had probably the best excuse of the lot, who said he didn't want to attempt a film that relied totally on a young actor's performance as to whether it worked or not. But Blatty knew exactly who the right man was to make this film the right way. With the book still at the top of the bestsellers chart, he sent a copy to Friedkin, who was on a pre-release publicity tour for his current work, a little movie called The French Connection. When he first received it, Friedkin initially ignored the novel. He was just too busy with tour appointments. But waiting in a San Francisco hotel for a dinner engagement, he began to read through it. He then cancelled his dinner date and continued reading all of that evening and well into the night. By the time Friedkin had finished reading, he was totally hooked. He called Blatty at once and told him he thought it was wonderful and that he would love to do it. Blatty was excited. He'd got his man. But still, the studio was unrelenting. Time went by, and as if by magic, on October 7th, 1971, everything changed. The French Connection was released, and Blatty called the studio heads and begged them to go watch it. The following day, he got a call back from the head of production at Warner's. "Bill, believe us, we want Friedkin more than you do. He's our man." Once again, that element of luck, and crucially, timing, had come to the rescue, and the project now really began to move forward. So why did Blatty want Friedkin so badly? What was it about his style and track record that he found so compelling? 50 years on, the choice seems inevitable and so obvious, but that's with the benefit of hindsight and with the knowledge that in making the movie, Friedkin didn't put a foot wrong. It is such an assured and confident example of filmmaking. One of the reasons was that Friedkin had been almost the first person who had reacted to the book in the same way that Blatty had reacted to the original Exorcism. Like Blatty, Billy Friedkin saw The Exorcist as far more than a horror film. It was a compelling supernatural murder mystery with a moral theme, and he wanted audiences to believe in it. Speaking in 1979, he made that point clearly.
The Exorcist is based on a true story, a case that took place in the Washington area, actually in Silver Springs, Maryland, in 1948 or 1949. It was a case of the possession of a 14-year-old boy. That case was widely reported in the newspapers of that day, especially the Washington Post, which did a series of long, lengthy articles about that case of possession. Bill Blatty, the creator of The Exorcist, was an undergraduate at Georgetown University in that area when this case took place. And not only did he read the newspaper articles at the time, but he later had access to a lot of very confidential material in the archives at Georgetown University, which I also saw many years later, having to do not only with the diaries of the actual exorcist, but of doctors and nurses who were in attendance when this bizarre story occurred. And Bill Blatty worked for the better part of 20 years formulating the novel that became The Exorcist. It was, as I say, based on a true story. And the details in the actual case are every bit as mystifying and exciting and bizarre as what Bill so brilliantly recreated in his novel and in his film script. So there was no reason to hulk it up, as they did, for example, with the so-called sequel to The Exorcist, which is nothing but hokum. The Exorcist itself is based on a true but highly puzzling occurrence. So it had to be presented as realistically as possible.
Friedkin's work had been based in documentaries, and that conversation with Blake Edwards about Peter Gunn had shown Blatty that Friedkin was a man of principle and strength of character. But Friedkin's background could hardly have been less auspicious. Like Blatty's, it was not comfortable or middle class. And also like Blatty, without the influence of his mother, it might well have come to nothing. She took him to the local picture house in Chicago, where he was captivated by the thought of working in movies. The defining moment came when he went in to see Citizen Kane, and 8 hours later was still sitting enchanted as the final screening came to a close.
When William Friedkin was young, he was a street kid. He was raised by essentially his mother, because his father died early, and he loved to roam the streets of Chicago, meeting people, picking up scraps of information. He was very aimless and barely got out of high school. In fact, he had to be held back a semester. So he was what you call an autodidact. Anything he learned on his own. and he's never stopped learning. Friedkin was somewhat rebellious, but he still had a wonderful ability to know people, to read people. That's how he talked his way into a job as a messenger at a local television station. And in fact, as his career went on in television in Chicago in the 1950s and early 60s, he managed to rise through all of the different levels until he became a floor director and then went out and shot something called The People vs. Paul Crump, which was a documentary.
With that as a calling card, he made some more TV documentaries as a freelancer in Hollywood before learning his craft on varying and very different projects. The Sonny and Cher vehicle, Good Times, which is surprisingly good considering. The Boys in the Band, and, perhaps most importantly from a director's point of view, working with a top-class writer and a really capable cast in Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party. It showed a compassionate and competent handling of what was really a stage play on location. Nothing remarkable at the box office, but intellectually and artistically challenging, and very credible for his reputation.
Is that you, Petey? Are you back?
Yes?
I've got your cornflakes ready.
By the time the big break came, he was ready. It happened to be his next project,
Eat your cornflakes?
which changed the whole ballgame for Friedkin. The French Connection.
All right, Popeye's here. Get your hands on your heads. Get off the bar and get on the wall. What's my name?
Popeye Doyle. If he doesn't like you, he'll take you apart. And it's all perfectly legal, because Doyle fights dirty
You want to take a ride there, fat man?
and plays rough.
Anybody want a milkshake?
Doyle is bad news, but he's a good cop.
How many times have I been downhearted, looked up and saw him smiling like a shining dime? Yeah. And hoped that he would stay and tell me why he was so happy.
The French Connection.
Those men nominated this year for the Best Achievement in Directing:
Peter Bogdanovich for The Last Picture Show, BBS Productions, Columbia.
William Friedkin for The French Connection, D'Antoni Productions, 20th Century Fox;
Norman Jewison for The Fiddler on the Roof, Maurice Cartier Productions, United Artists.
Stanley Kubrick for A Clockwork Orange, a Hawks Films Limited production, Warner Brothers; and John Schlesinger for Sunday, Bloody Sunday, a Joseph Yanni production, United Artists.
And here it is, the winner.
No, Frank, I know that we always alternate between presenters, but I truly believe the winner would rather hear it from you.
That's a nice. Okay, I'm very nervous doing this. The winner is William Friedkin.
This is a tremendous honor, and I'm very proud to accept it. I'm proud, too, of the people that helped me to make The French Connection. The people of 20th Century Fox, the entire cast and crew, especially Roy Scheider and Gene Hackman for their fine performances, Jerry Greenberg for his cutting, Owen Roisman for his photography. But most of all, I would like to thank the man who made it all possible. Not only made it possible for the picture to be made, but for me to direct it. I owe it all to him. His name is Phil D'Antoni. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Empowered by the Oscar win, Friedkin started work on The Exorcist. For his first task, Friedkin set about working on the script with Bill Blatty.
Bill did write a screenplay, which he gave me. Bill hired me to direct the film, not Warner Brothers, but
Right.
Bill Blatty. I was his choice to direct the picture. And he had written a screenplay, which he presented to me after he had hired me. I didn't care for Bill's original screenplay. I thought that it was not a faithful rendering of his novel. I thought that he did take it far afield. That was just my opinion. It wasn't his. But what I did with Bill was to get him to start all over again from scratch and tell the story in the script as he had told it in the novel. We went back and as I think he would tell you, became more faithful to the novel than he did in his first draft screenplay before he ever called on me to direct it.
In fact, Friedkin handed Blatty an annotated copy of the book, filled with his notes with particular sequences and speeches to leave in and what to leave out.
There were certain things that I would at this time call minor disagreements that we had about what should be left out. Whenever they came up, both of us had a full airing of our disagreements, and I always prevailed because Bill was not a neophyte to this business. He knows that the director, who was calling the shots on the floor and with the actors and in the cutting room, has got to go his way. The initial decision that Bill made to hire me was to put his faith in me. And though we disagreed on a few things, he allowed me to prevail.
Now it was time for Friedkin to put his faith in others. The most crucial decision was who was to play Reagan.
Well, we had to find a 12-year-old girl to play Reagan.
That must have been...
There was nobody around that you could say, well, she'd be good, you know. We auditioned over 500 girls. I stopped counting after 500. And Linda Blair got the part for one reason only, her incredible intelligence and sensitivity. She was the brightest and most sensitive young girl that I've ever known, and easy to deal with, and she completely understood all the ramifications of this material at her age at that time. And she was an A student, an honor student. So she was totally pulled together, and I felt that she wouldn't suffer any psychic repercussions as a result of making the film.
And the world wanted to be reassured that despite it all, she was still an angel-faced, all-American cutie.
Linda, there are various rumours that you were affected psychologically by the film, which are no doubt untrue, but what is the situation? Did it disturb you in any way?
It didn't at all.
It didn't?
No, people I think just, they felt that I'd have to come out kind of with problems or something, and that's how it started. I don't know. But no, I've never had any.
You haven't?
No, I haven't.
In the case of Ellen Burstyn, the studio wanted any number of major stars to play her part. But Ellen Burstyn called me when she had heard I was going to direct The Exorcist. She called and said she wanted to be in it. Would I come and meet with her? I did. I met with her. Again, I found her sensitive and intelligent and someone who had a complete grasp of what the story was about. And so I didn't want a star. I wanted Ellen Burstyn.
Right.
Max von Sydow was always our first choice for Father Merrin.
Perfect.
He has always, in the films he made with Ingmar Bergman at least, represented a certain strength of character and moral strength, which he brings with him to almost everything he does. Except he left it home when he did the sequel, the so-called sequel to The Exorcist, with the hairy tick or whatever they
which we'll get into
refer
a little
to.
later.
But Jack McGowran was may he rest in peace, was my first choice to play Burke Dennings, the director. He was a brilliant but little-known actor from the Irish theater. Jason Miller, that's the subject of another interview. That's such a long story of how we got onto him. I wanted an unknown for that part. I didn't want any one of the several names that were proposed or who had proposed themselves. I believe that the man who came on wearing the priest's collar performing this exorcism had to be an actor that was completely acceptable to the audience as a priest. I had seen his play in New York, to make a long story short, and the play was very powerful, moved me. I then met the author and saw in him the physical characteristics of Father Karras. It then turned out that Jason had at one time studied for the priesthood, had gone to Catholic University, and was trained as a Jesuit. So all of those things began to add up. I did a screen test with him and liked it, and he got the part.
It's one thing to assemble a terrific cast, but it's an entirely different thing getting a great performance out of them. Friedkin was determined to do so, and would resort to virtually any means to achieve that aim.
Although William Friedkin is a very talented director of actors, he kind of learned it on the job training. And so when he wanted to get responses from people, sometimes he had to, and a lot of other directors do this, create an atmosphere on the set whereby the actor would react as the character would react. Two instances in particular occur. One is that he would sometimes bring in a handgun and fire it to startle the actors. Actors don't like this because they believe they can startle themselves if necessary for a scene. And it got to the point where he was firing it so often that one day Max von Sydow came onto the set for his call. He turned to the director of photography, Owen Roisman, and said, "All right, Owen, where did Billy hide the handguns today?" The other instance of Friedkin eliciting a performance from an actor happened at the very end of the film, where Father Karras has taken the tumble down the steps and his close friend, Father O'Malley, has to give him last rites. It was the wee hours of the morning in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. It was cold as a witch's, well, you know what I'm talking about. And they couldn't get the shot because O'Malley, who was a priest, not a trained actor, simply couldn't muster tears the way he wanted to. So Friedkin told him, "Bill, do you trust me?" O'Malley said, "Well, of course I trust you." And Billy Friedkin hauled off and slugged the priest as hard as he could and said, "Roll him, action." And that's the scene that's now in the movie. And afterwards, when it was over, Billy and Bill hugged each other because the priest knew exactly what Friedkin had to do in order to get the shot.
And Billy was known to be a tyrant. Really, he treated his people very firmly and sometimes not very respectfully. But whenever I would come and see him, the editors who were with him on the stage would tell me afterward that we're always so glad when you come and visit because Billy is so civil and kind to you and enjoys your visits, and so he's nice to us as well. And then once you leave, he goes back to beating us up. So I was amused by that.
Just as with the casting of the actors, Friedkin adopted a similar attitude to the crew and production unit. He was not afraid to take a chance on untried professionals who he considered had the right attitude. Owen Roisman, the DOP he had blooded on The French Connection, was a good foil for Friedkin. They were a formidable team, both basing their filmmaking on in-camera effects and a verite style of shooting. But equally, the DOP was all for experimentation and trying new ways of shooting in a dramatic and powerful way, devising jib and crane moves and even an above-stairs hoist to get a Steadicam style of shot in the days before Steadicam was even invented. Meanwhile, in Dick Smith, he had a real genius in the makeup department who fully took on the challenge and the considerable opportunity The Exorcist offered. 50 years on, his work is still a subject lesson to all aspiring makeup artists. Both he and Friedkin professed to the less is more school of thought and wanted to keep Linda Blair looking as much as possible like the innocent young woman, despite everything that was happening to her. Also, like Friedkin, Smith had a TV background and found the liberating larger budgets allowed him to spend longer experimenting with various effects. He tried 6 different looks for Linda Blair and screen tested all of them. He finally settled on the self-abuse style we all now know. After some trial and error, the special effects team, run by Marcel Vacuta Jr., produced extraordinary results using unconventional methods. Vacuta built the Reagan model, complete with turning head, the revised set, and also showed that a bed could fly. And even in the days before CGI, paranormal happenings were produced on cue. Wires, cantilevered lifts, and pneumatic pumps were all put to great use in constructing not one, but 2 versions of the bed, flying ornaments, and crashing windows. Incredibly inventive and remarkably skilled, Friedkin described Vacuta as the behind-the-scenes contributor who had the greatest single impact on the movie.
You know, you never had a horror film, although I don't think The Exorcist is really a horror film, directed like a documentary. We've had many since then, like Blair Witch Project and certain films like that, but nobody ever really brought reality to a horror film. The characteristics of success that William Friedkin brought to The Exorcist were reality. Not only did he have the performances at a point where they could have been in a drama because it was played as a drama, he also had every single effect that you see happen in front of the camera. There was only one optical effect, and that was the pea soup spew. But otherwise, when things floated, when things moved across the room, when things shook, when windows broke, when doors cracked, when curtains blew. They weren't done in the optical printer. They were all happening right there on the set. And that kind of reality not only makes the audience understand that something special is going on, they help the actors achieve a level that was real for them.
Friedkin wanted a subtle, almost minimal score. He compared it to just a touch on the shoulder, not being hit over the head with obvious orchestral effects. Friedkin felt he needed something special, childlike and haunting for a special main theme. He began scouring music lists and record libraries. Across the Atlantic, the prodigious performer and composer he would choose had only just made his recording debut. Seen here making his TV debut on Old Grey Whistle Test on the BBC. What's more, Oldfield was ensconced in what was known as underground experimental prog and had recorded a whole album filled with one track, with no vocals and no sign of a hit single. Friedkin found it when going through the Warner's music library on a yet-to-be-released white-labelled disc. After one listen, he knew he had found the one, rather like his Linda Blair moment. Tubular Bells might have been an extremely left-field choice, but for the director, that made it all the better. With no audience preconceptions and the unusual, uneasy rhythm of Oldfield's composition, it was totally in keeping with the nature of the film. For the audience, it was otherworldly, mysterious, unsettling, and would sell in enormous quantities. It is in fact another one of the lasting legacies of The Exorcist, that by using Tubular Bells, the record label Virgin, of which Tubular Bells was the first ever record, run by Richard Branson, was yet to make any money whatsoever. The massive sales of Tubular Bells changed all of that, and it's debatable that without The Exorcist's influence, Branson, Virgin, and those myriad Virgin companies like the airline might never have taken off.
When the editing was going on, Blatty was locked out of the editing room, according to his side. According to the other side, Blatty had hepatitis and couldn't come to the editing room. When Blatty saw the first cut of the film, he loved it. He thought it was perfect. And then Friedkin, acting on the advice of the people at Warner Brothers, took a few scenes out which they thought were redundant or gave things away a little bit too early. These are scenes such as the stairwell conference between Fathers Marin and Karras, a first examination of Reagan by the doctors, and a few other things like that. Blatty then saw it and says he doesn't think it's a great film anymore, and he was sore for decades that Friedkin had made these cuts. Finally, in the early 2000s, Friedkin agreed that they would go back in and they would restore the cuts. Obviously, it was for a new issue on video. He did, and then Blatty fell back into the Friedkin camp, and the two of them remained best friends until Blatty's death.
The editing process was not without other conflicts as well. Friedkin and his team worked right up to the deadline. A week before the much-vaunted Boxing Day release, the film was still being tweaked. The director even went so far as to inspect where the film was being shown and creating a style sheet with finely detailed notes for the projectionists. The sound was also laboured over, endlessly. Low-level sounds of wasps trapped in jam jars, hamsters on wheels and pigs being taken to slaughter were all blended in with strange sound effects, fingernails on blackboards, cries and whispers. It was immensely time-consuming and expensive. The budget was exceeded, but the resultant sound was, and still is, very special. Friedkin dispatched a viewing copy of the work to date to the anxious Warner's execs in Hollywood.
And Warner Brothers, although they wanted to leave him alone, were also concerned when the budget practically doubled. The budget of the film doubled because they had problems with the practical effects. The cold room, the set burned down once, little things like that. But when he finally got the film together and he showed it to the Warner Brothers executives, he had an assistant editor, Craig McKay, who's in the book, take the print to Warner Brothers from New York and screened it for them, for all the head people. And John Calley, who was the head of the studio then, had dead silence after they'd seen the first cut of The Exorcist. They'd been giving Friedkin all sorts of trouble about the budget, about schedule, and they saw the film. There was silence for 3 minutes, and then Calley turns to this guy and says, "You go back and you tell William Friedkin he can have whatever he wants, carte blanche at the studio." The fella called Friedkin and said, "The studio says you can have carte blanche." And Billy, to his everlasting credit, said, "Really?"
Friedkin responded by setting up 4 cutting rooms side by side, with a separate editor in each, with each editor cutting different scenes. For 18 hours a day, Friedkin would prowl from one to the next, ensuring that the cut was exactly as he wished it. As on French Connection, he instructed his editors to cut on the offbeat, not where a conventional edit would be, so the audience subconsciously felt uncomfortable and uneasy with the shot changes and the rhythm of the movie. Simultaneously, Friedkin worked with Dan Perry in creating the opening titles.
In the case of The Exorcist, it was a matter of less is more, where the elements that lived on the screen were just the titles themselves. There was no graphics, there was no animation, only the titles themselves and the music that accompanied it. So whatever character and texture and personality and emotion had to be embodied in the type itself. In fact, Billy Friedkin asked me to be one of the graders of the film. And so I went to the lab, and he required that the lab view every single print, not just pieces of it, and not at high speed, at regular speed, to make sure there's no dirt, no flaws, and so on. So I was one of those graders, and I viewed it probably 30 times, only silent, without soundtrack, at the lab. But I knew so well the cut and what came next and so on. It still scared the hell out of me. That's how powerful the film was.
Friedkin and Perry also worked together on the advertising campaign featuring the iconic poster shot inspired by René Magritte's painting The Empire of Light, giving The Exorcist its otherworldly and slightly surreal atmosphere. So Friedkin even managed to control the publicity as well. Finally, with hours to spare and his final checklist in hand, Friedkin made a last-minute tour of the movie houses that were about to screen the film. And then, on December 26, 1973, The Exorcist opened. "50 years on, what is undeniable is that a whole generation of filmgoers and filmmakers have been influenced by the creation of William Peter Blatty and Bill Friedkin. Together they created a piece of work that is of its time, blending the hallmarks of new Hollywood with classic filmmaking and combining some of the greatest talents both in front of and behind the camera. By insisting on filming in Washington and in New York, Friedkin managed to maintain control of the production away from the suits in Hollywood. There was no decision-making by committee.
The Exorcist survives and has its power because it is not a horror film per se, because the villain is not your normal villain. Satan is not Dracula or the Wolfman or the Frankenstein monster who can follow you home from the movie theater. Satan's waiting for you in the closet or under the bed, and that really disturbs people, and I think it accounts entirely for the film's success. That and, of course, the fact that it's one of the most brilliantly made motion pictures in cinema history.
We have an innate sense that it might be real. When you're watching a movie like Halloween or Psycho or any scary movie you can think of, yes, you jump and you're scared and it's terrifying, but when the lights come up, you recognize, well, the odds of my running into a serial killer or someone coming up out of the grave are pretty small. But there's something in the human person that recognizes, whether we want to or not, that there might be something real there, and that makes it terrifying. That makes it terrifying.
The lack of CGI actually helps the timeless quality of the movie. There are no dodgy graphics or electronic effects that could date. The skill of the makeup and the special effects team can stand untrammeled by any faddish animation tricks and stunts. But also, it is simply a great synthesis of the skills of a director at the height of his powers and an inspired author with his lifelong project. Billy Friedkin, a filmmaker playing to the strengths of the writer and wringing out all the nuances and questions raised by Peter Blatty. And even 50 years on, when Ellen Burstyn starts her walk from the campus to her home, next to those foreboding steps, and Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells starts playing as she makes her way through Georgetown, peopled by the kids in their Halloween outfits, the nuns in the billowing habits, and two priests grappling with their faith, I defy anyone not to feel the tiniest twinge as those hairs start to rise on the back of your neck.
The world of darkness.
The odds are strong that in 50 years from now, we'll be watching The Exorcist as it celebrates its centenary. That is the power of The Exorcist.